All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're so glad you're here. Before we get started, we wanted to note just a few housekeeping points. To avoid background noise, all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We will be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as the webinar continues, please enter them into the questions box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen if viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of your screen if viewing from a phone. If you have any comments or concerns during the webinar, please also enter these into the questions box. We will review and address any immediate needs as they occur. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to each registrant tomorrow. The recording will also be available on our website at www.namimd.org for any individuals that were unable to register. After the webinar today, you will be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. We plan to continue hosting educational webinars, and we ask that you please fill out this survey to let us know how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. NAMI is excited to partner with BetterHelp to support our local healthcare workers by providing access to a free month of therapy. BetterHelp is convenient, private, online therapy where you can talk to a licensed professional therapist at any time. If you are a healthcare worker, including mental health and/or substance use provider, be sure to fill out the post-webinar feedback form to receive instructions and your discount. I'll now hand it over to our moderator, Sarah.
Everyone, and thank you again for joining us. I am Sarah Weissman, a board member with NAMI Maryland, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. We are pleased you've joined us today for this very important topic. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken its toll on many who have lost friends, family members, and coworkers. Many of us are grieving the loss of normalcy and familiarity. You're here today to learn about ways to move through grief and cope with the loss brought on by the ongoing pandemic. NAMI Maryland supports you in the hard work you do, and we want you to benefit from your time with us this afternoon. Today, we are hosting Dr. Alex Chan. He will show us the 6 stages of grief according to clinical research, offer strategies for coping and finding meaning in the loss, and he'll help us begin to assemble a narrative of resilience to address pandemic-related grief. CEUs are not provided for today's webinar, but a certificate of attendance will be sent to each registered participant tomorrow afternoon. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Alex Chan. Dr. Chan is the Mental and Behavioral Health Specialist for the University of Maryland Extension Family and Consumer Sciences Program. He brings practical knowledge and experience in stress management, family relations, and adolescent development. His recent program development has focused on enhancing mental health among youth, the farming community, and healthcare industry. He holds master's and doctoral degrees in human development and family studies from Auburn University. Dr. Chan is also a licensed marriage and family therapist in Maryland and the District of Columbia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Chan, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Glad to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right. So a little bit more, for those of you who are not familiar with Extension, I wanted to give a brief overview of what Extension is and my role there. So Extension is the non-formal educational outreach wing of the University of Maryland. We have offices in all 23 counties and Baltimore City. And our mission is to provide education that's research-based, that kind of along the lines of news that you can use, translating the research that's done in the university system into programming that can be utilized by the general public. We have a variety of program areas. The founding program of Extension was agriculture, so training farmers in better farming practices and regulations and all that. And my area, family and consumer sciences, covers what you might have traditionally considered to be home economics type topics. So finance, nutrition, human development, and mental health. So that's the program, the area that I come from. We also have youth development programs through the 4-H program, as well as natural resources and environmental stewardship programs. So I encourage you all to look us up online, University of Maryland Extension, and browse our programs. So that's a little bit of a background. So let's jump in now to the topic of today. It is grief. I do like to start, even though it's a heavy topic, with a little bit of humor, and you can tell I've been using this slide for quite some time now, and actually I'll be showing you another slide in this presentation that I've been using for quite some time. Had to do some alterations, but seems like for the past couple years, and maybe even before that, it's always something, right? There's always some other new stressor adding to our plates of things that, you know, may be contributing to a sense of being overwhelmed. And, you know, although the topic is grief, you know, the variety of stressors that we're all experiencing right now really, you know, complicates the process of managing any one particular emotion. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, year after year, last year I was showing the original meme here, which was 2020 showing 21 around the workplace, and this year it kind of feels the same. So just wanted to acknowledge that we're still dealing with a lot, and grief is something heavy, but we are today going to learn a little bit about grief and what can be done to help push it along, with some special attention to some of the features of grief that have really affected us during the past couple of years. I always like to give acknowledgement to an initial article that was written that I think jump-started the public awareness of the experience of grief. So 2 years ago almost now, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review, which there's a little screenshot of the internet article here by Scott Baronato. He wrote the article, "That discomfort you're feeling is grief." And I read that not too long after it was published, and I thought, yeah, that's true. It was, you know, we were all kind of struggling with the recent shutdowns, and we were worrying about what would come next, and we were going through, you know, a grief process. But I think that he was one of the first people, along with some of the folks that he interviews in this article, to label that experience as grief. And I think it's important that we label experiences like this, because from a medical standpoint, you might say that with accurate diagnosis comes effective treatment, right? If you're trying to solve one problem and you're applying the solution for a different problem, you're not going to have the success you're looking for in overcoming it. So I thought that this was a really important article that a couple of years ago kind of got this, you know, this awareness to more of the public. So I encourage you all to also look that one up and read it in case you haven't. And now it's more like a historical article, right? Because the past couple of years have felt like many years probably packed into two, but I still think it's worth it. All right. So I think we should begin by, you know, asking ourselves, you know, what have we lost during the pandemic? And I know that, you know, you're all muted right now. You can't really necessarily say out loud, but just think to yourself, you know, what have people lost during the pandemic? I'm sure that there is a variety of things, and you know, not only personal things that you may have lost, but kind of general things that a lot of us have lost. So in the past, I have heard some responses from folks in the audience that you know, mention things like graduations and, you know, events that they were looking forward to, and now that has evolved, right? You know, so early on when there was more shutdowns, it was like loss of events and things. I think that since 2020, there's also been the experience of losing some other things like trust in larger institutions. I think depending on your experience with your local government or your healthcare institutions or public health entities, you know, there may be some sense of loss there in terms of how do I know who has the right information, where it's coming from, because I think that's been a pretty universal experience. You know, we've all had to grapple with trying to figure out what is reliable and what isn't, and perhaps that wasn't necessarily at the top of our minds, you know, before this past couple of years. Okay, so I see that someone from the audience said trust and self-confidence. Yeah, so depending on how the events of the past couple of years and all the disruptions, it could be that you've lost some of your own self-confidence. Like, am I able to make it through something like this? I also see normalcy and predictability. Oh yes, huge. So aside from losing out on specific events that we were looking forward to, there was this sort of routine that we were accustomed to. And for better or for worse, we lost it. It's not, some of our routines maybe we were glad to lose, but I think others provided us with comfort, that we took comfort in some of the routines that we had, whether they were with family or whether they were on our own, just our personal routines that we went through. So yeah, I also see loved ones, jobs, finance, health, events. Yeah, so many different losses. So anytime I bring this question up, because grief is the emotional response to loss, and anything that was important to you can be grieved if you've lost it, or it produces that grief response if you've lost it. So it's not just the experience of losing someone who has died. It is also the experience of losing something that was important to you. And of course, jobs are important to us. Finance definitely important to us. We create dreams for ourselves out of the security that jobs and our financial stability brings us. So when we lose out on that security, we also lose out on those dreams, and we have to come up with a new plan. So these are all relevant losses, and conceivably could produce the grief response, and probably have. So what happens when we're going through grief? I think a lot of us may have learned in school or just by soaking it up through pop culture that there's always been references in resolving the 5 stages of grief. So on the left side of the screen, you'll see 1 through 5 is the typical words that we have used to describe those stages. And we have also typically viewed them in a sort of linear fashion. Like, you begin with denial that, oh, this can't be happening. I'm not even going to acknowledge that the loss has occurred. And we did see some of that, of course, at the start of the pandemic. Going on through anger, bargaining, oh, I'm so angry that this is, I'm being deprived of something. This is not fair. Bargaining, like trying to figure out, can you negotiate with your life circumstances in some way to avoid the loss, or prevent it from hurting you so much. Then depression, when you realize that maybe you can't avoid a certain loss. And then finally acceptance, saying, all right, I'm okay. Like, I now understand that the loss is occurring, and I'm not trying to fight it, and I'm not sad about it. I've accepted it. So the problem with just those first 5 stages was that a lot of times people, when they, even if they were at that acceptance stage, felt that there was something missing. It was sort of not enough to say, oh, I'm accepting of this loss. Like, I know I can't fight it anymore. I'm not angry. I'm not necessarily as sad about it, but there's still some gap. There's still something missing in my life. And that is actually where that Harvard Business Review article that I mentioned came into play, because he also in that article is interviewing an expert on grief, and they start talking about meaning, making sense of the loss. And this is what we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about, is how to get that going. Because you may identify with the experience that, yeah, it's one thing to accept a loss, it's another thing to be able to fit it into kind of your life story and have it make sense, so that there's not just this kind of hole in how you view what's going on in life. So there was a missing component, and in the past maybe couple decades, there's been more and more attention, at least among the community of psychology and research in that realm, to acknowledge the need for meaning. So we also now no longer view the stages as going through like a linear progression. So you may be in the state of anger one day, and then maybe you're feeling accepting the next day, and then the next day you might slip back and feel like there's, you know, a lot of sadness, depression. So it's normal, and that's why I put these arrows up and down to go through these stages with a sort of general arc towards acceptance and meaning making. So don't feel, if you are in the middle of experiencing loss right now, or a more acute loss more recently, don't feel like you're something's wrong with you if you feel up and down. That's normal. That it's not, you know, it's not a linear process, and it's going to look different. Each one of these stages may look different depending on the individual. For example, for some folks, depression looks like being irritable. It might look like anger, especially among, you know, teenagers, especially among boys, teen boys. You know, that group tends to emote depression as something that's more irritated, rather than like obviously sad. So it looks different for everybody. All right. And I also want to remind everyone that these losses that are not quite concrete, so ambiguous, are abstract losses where it's like, okay, I lost my dream of something, or I lost my, someone mentioned, you know, their confidence, their self-confidence or trust in other people or institutions. Those are abstract, but when you lose it, it still leaves a gap in your life that needs to be processed. And then, you know, you also go through this process when you might even begin this process when you know a loss is coming. You know, and this is often the case, like if you're dealing with the anticipated loss of a loved one, or you are seeing something, you know, in the news that may affect your job, like you're anticipating that, oh my gosh, you know, I just heard the latest news, maybe I'm going to lose my job. So you start going through this process of anticipatory grief, which is sort of mixed up with anxiety there too. So all that being said, grief is more complex than, you know, a 5-stage process. It can start before the loss has happened. It can start with the experience of not just death, but a variety of abstract losses, and the recovery process is nonlinear. So that information, you know, is informing us on, you know, how we approach grief in general, to be a little more accepting, well, you know, accepting of the process in general. All right, so before we get into meaning making, I just wanted to briefly acknowledge that there are a variety of first aid or foundational mental health activities that are always a good idea to try to incorporate when you're dealing with stressors. These are the kinds of things that both in the short term and long term can help support your mental health and provide that foundation of you know, just stability, so that you can work on some of the other more deeper topics. So, you know, you may not have time one day to get into the depths of your grief and think about the stories and the meaning that you want to make of all of it. But perhaps maybe that day, if you just, you know, take some time to practice gratitude or do your exercises or eat well, doing that one thing can help keep you healthy enough so that, you know, the next day maybe you're able to do a little work on the grief. So these activities, always helpful. They're part of the foundation of self-care that is necessary for handling larger emotional issues. And I also love this graphic from a blog. It's actually an adaptation of the SAMHSA 8 Dimensions of Wellness that is just a little more visually appealing. But I think there's a mistaken view of self-care in these, like mental health, taking care of your mental health, as like either really expensive, like only rich people can do it, like you have to go to the spa in order to relax, or that it's something very like specific, like all it is, you know, curling up and being in your Snuggie and lighting candles, something, you know, kind of woo-woo like that. There's a variety of things that count as self-care. All of these things that you're looking at on the screen count as that foundational work to help you be able to tackle some of the deeper issues. So I would be remiss for not reminding all of us to just pick something to do for ourselves today, even if it's not directly related to that grief. You are providing yourself that foundation that will allow you to, bit by bit, deal with some of the heavier things. One more thing about this, try to You know, if you're picking an activity to take care of yourself, just pick one of the low-hanging fruit. Like, don't make the self-care activity another stressor for you. Like, it should be something that you're motivated to do. You know, at least at first. I mean, I know, you know, for example, all of us could probably be better at like exercise or something, but if that's stressing you out, like just try to pick something that you know you're able to do, and that doesn't cause you extra stress or remind you of work or something like that. For example, you know, I know this show may or may not be over now, but like I would not choose to watch the show This Is Us if I was trying to like take care of myself, because it would remind me of work. It's like all these like family emotional issues, like intense conflict. Like yeah. So, you know, that's why I say there's a variety of things. Okay, so with that foundation though, and there's a whole other training I could do on, you know, just taking care of yourself and planning for that. I am going to focus the rest of our time though on the topic of today, which is grief. So the stories we tell us matter. This is where we get at the meaning making of the grief process. As we look back on loss, we are all just inherently creating a story about it. And some of the automatic stories that our mind will just generate up front are not necessarily going to be the most helpful ones. They may be factually correct, or they may make sense to us on some level, but the first stories that come to our minds may not be the ones that carry us forward. So I think that, you know, if you bring the mindset of this story needs to carry me forward and make it more of like a chapter of my life rather than like where the story like ended and all of a sudden everything was different, like to the extent that you can tell a story that brings you forward and that is motivational in a way, that will actually help you make sense of the grief and not be stuck, you know, in one of the earlier stages. So there are some things that you can do to help craft that new story or that more resilient story that will help you begin to resolve that grief. And these activities are not only things that you can do on your own, but they're things that can be done with others, and that helps you sort of rehearse the story. We all need to do this. We all need to rehearse the stories that we tell ourselves, because that makes them feel more real or acceptable to us. And if some of you out there are thinking, wait, so I'm just supposed to like trick myself into thinking that everything is okay? No. Remember, we do this all the time. When you're making a difficult decision about something where there's two viable options, we all tend to rehearse the reasons for engaging in the option we eventually choose. It doesn't mean that the reasons of the other one are not valid. It just means that we're focusing on the reasons that help us make a decision. So we all do this anyway, and this also applies to grief. It's not tricking ourselves, it's just helping us move. So this is the slide where I'm going to show you a few different iterations of this initial question. So I did develop this presentation almost 2 years ago. And since then, I've been through several iterations of it. So you can see that the first question that being a member of this world, and only, you know, I exist in the here and now, I can't see the future. So as much as I would like to, this was my first question from a couple years ago. How will I emerge from this crisis? So the goal is still the same, right? It's helping you think about like a resilient, like how do I want to emerge from this crisis? You know, what do I want to see for myself looking back? But that became an inappropriate question as we went forward and realized we're not emerging so neatly from this crisis. So I replaced it with this next iteration that said, well, what does it say about me that I'm, you know, living through this crisis? And that sort of removes some of the, you know, the triggering of like, we're not getting out, but it still helps you think about the positive aspect, right? That you are surviving in some way. You know, everyone here has survived this far, and so there is something to be said about the fact that you've made it this far. And yes, I'm sure there's a variety of things that have been stressful and troubling, but it's worth thinking about, you know, from a positive standpoint of what does it say about me that I'm living through this. And the way you say that to yourself matters. So sometimes when we say something like, what does it say about me? We say it with the tone of judgment, like, oh, what does that say about me? You know, it's like, oh, it says something bad. I encourage you to ask yourself this question with a positive internal tone of voice. So what does it say about me that I'm living through this? You know, that implies that, like, oh, I should be impressed about something, even if it's just surviving. You know, so say it that way to yourself and see what answers come to mind. So that's one question that you could ask yourself. Another equally valid question that I think is even more appropriate, because this was like my intermediate question. This is my most recent question. What has changed and how have I responded? So I think today, this is probably the most appropriate question as we think about our losses that we've experienced and how we've had to adapt. So that's kind of beneath this question. What has changed, or, you know, how have I responded to the losses that I've experienced? How have I adapted to the losses that I've experienced? So you can see that especially if you use that word, you know, respond or adapt implies that you are making changes that are necessary to help you keep, you know, moving forward, that you are responding in a positive way. So again, even if your answer here is, well, all I've done is really just kind of survive and tread water, it may still be worth it to ask this question of, well, what does it say about you that you've been able to tread water so long? I mean, that's hard. But what I would hope is that you can also bring yourself to this question of, you know, how am I showing my own strength and resilience here? How am I adapting? So this is a big question, and this is like the central question of this process of meaning making, especially as it relates to the pandemic. So this question may not get at loss of life specifically, like how am I dealing with the loss of a loved one? It could, but I crafted this question to help you tell the story about the pandemic in general. Because I think for a lot of us, we still haven't perhaps yet come up with that narrative of, like, how do we make sense of this whole experience we've been through? It's sort of just this barrage of events that has occurred in the past couple of years, and we're just holding on for life. But I think that when you start thinking about these questions, how have you changed? How have you responded? How have you adapted? That begins a new story for yourself that might actually be uplifting, might actually carry you forward, so that when you are looking back at, you know, perhaps one of these days we'll be able to answer this emerging from the crisis questions. But when you are looking back from the future on this time, you will be able to tell a story that isn't just like, I hit a brick wall and fell down, because that would make any of us sad, and make us feel stuck. But that you'll also say, well, I fell down, but I also showed these resilient characteristics. I responded in this way. I adapted in this way. So I encourage you all to start thinking about the answer to this question now. There will be a chance to share a little bit. I know maybe not all of you have access to chat right now, but there will be a chance in a little while to share your story. So start thinking about it. Some examples of building a resilient narrative, some beginnings. Well, when this is over, I want to be able to say that I rediscovered my strength or new skills, relationships, etc. You know, maybe that's how you begin this story. Or maybe in response to that middle question, you say, wow, isn't it impressive that I have survived? I'm here, given the level of chaos that I've experienced. And I would say I'm definitely talking to parents of children under 5. So, because, you know, you all have largely been forgotten by policy and, you know, the movement for, you know, vaccines and everything. Like, you know, I know they're working on it, but I know that parents in that category feel forgotten. So given the level of chaos that you've experienced, it is impressive. And to the extent that you can start saying that to yourself, if you might notice a little of that self-confidence perhaps coming back And in response to that question of, well, what has changed and how have I responded? Well, the pandemic caused me to reevaluate X in my life and make changes. So in the news, we've heard a lot about the Great Resignation, right? And perhaps some of us in this session today are part of that Great Resignation. So you might begin your story, or there might be a chapter of your story here that says, well, the pandemic really caused me to reevaluate my work situation in my life and how that was causing me, more pain than benefit. And so I took a leap of faith and looked for something new. So when you tell it like that, again, you see that there's a lot that you can draw pride and strength from, even as you think about this very chaotic period of our lives. So again, start thinking about yours. So that's kind of the individual component. That's the individual component, the work that starts internally. It's not all internal though, right? Because there was a little note in the question slide that said, you might need to even think about your story with somebody else. And, that could be a friend, a family member, a therapist, can definitely help you start to put that story together. So once you've got that bit of your story, it's important to also support others, but at the same time, not letting them make meaning for you, right? So I mentioned rehearsal is important to help these stories stick and feel true. We all need to share our stories with other people, not only to hear ourselves say it out loud, which helps, but also to give support. So when somebody's telling their story to you, they're also looking for some validation from you. So you don't need to listen to other people's stories about what they've been going through and how they've changed. You don't need to listen to that with the expectation of like giving them advice or changing your story. Like I remember early on, one of the earliest pandemic fads was the sourdough, right? Everyone became a baker. And I did not become a baker, but I recognized that other people did. And so I think some people, when they saw like all the like skills that other people were building, they might have thought, well, I'm not building any new skills right now, so what does that say about me? And they start judging themselves. So that's why I say you're there to support other people and just be happy that they're building those skills. But they don't have to make your meaning. Like if you're just saying like, wow, isn't it impressive that I just survived this? And who cares about becoming a new sourdough baker? then that's fine. That's still your story, and that's still going to carry you forward. And you can still be proud of other people for their meaning that they're making out of this situation. So friends and family, as it says here, friends and family need you to recognize their process just as much as you need them to give credit to yours. So it's all part of this rehearsal that is important for these ideas to stick. And all you need to give back to the people that are sharing their stories with you is validation. That's all they need. They don't need you to change what you're doing. They also don't need you to try to convince them of anything else. They just need validation. And a little joke about validation here. Remember, validation is not the same as reassurance or praise. So, if you can't see it, the guy says, "Will you validate my parking?" And then the attendant there says, "Oh, you did a great job, evenly spaced and nearly a perfect right angle." Okay, that's praise. That's not the same as validation. You don't have to tell somebody what a great, story they have. You just need to recognize what it meant for them, from their perspective. That's validation. And one way to remember this is that if you change the word but to because when you're saying things to people, like, I can understand why you might feel a certain way, or I see that, you might want this, and you say but, that negates the validation. So instead, when you say because, like, oh yeah, I see, that working on those bakery skills really worked for you because, and you give them their perspective back. You know, that helps you avoid giving your own commentary, you know, making it about you again. Because a lot of times you might say like, oh, well, I see how becoming a, you know, a sourdough baker worked for you, but for me, you know, that not only shifts the focus back to you when they're looking for validation on their thing, but it also like, it doesn't really, it shifts the focus back to you and it doesn't give them validation. The but negates the validation. So instead you say, oh, wow, yeah, I see how, you know, your, you know, becoming a baker was really worked for you, like, because, you know, you're so proud of your craft, you found a new hobby, you know, and, you know, you like seeing, you know, other people enjoy what you've made for them. And so, yeah, I really see how that worked for you. That's validation. Don't bring it back to you and why it wouldn't work for you, because that's not the point. All right. If you might also encounter somebody who is not yet there with their story of resilience, like you might be talking to someone else about what you've done today. You might, you know, come home and your, you know, loved one is there waiting for you, and you say, hey, you know, I went to this presentation and I'm thinking about the story of the past couple of years and blah, blah, blah. And your loved one or friend or whoever, they may still be in a darker place. You know, they might say, well, yeah, you know, I'm still feeling kind of crummy and this is all the stuff that I'm thinking about. Remember, validation again is not praise or reassurance. Sometimes people just need you to see that they get that they need you to see that you understand where they're at, even if they're not yet at that story of resilience. And actually, when you give them that validation, when the external environment, so you, mirrors the internal experience, the alarm bells go down. You know, they don't feel as urgent, you know, about that emotional experience. So it's okay to just meet somebody where they're at and, you know, not give them advice. This, you know, it's okay to give support if they want it, but most of the time people just need validation. It's all part of this rehearsal piece that is important to us as we build new ideas. So really save support for when somebody is truly asking for it. And I like this quote that says, sometimes you just need to talk about something, you know, not to get sympathy, but just to kill its power by allowing the truth of things to hit the air. I think that's such a great way of explaining the need for validation. And I think maybe we can, all of us can, something in our lives may resonate with that quote. Like, I was just talking about something and it felt good just to talk about it, not that I needed advice. So that's the next part of this grief process. You know, you're doing the internal work of like trying to revise your story. You are engaging with other people about it and repeating yourself, you know, multiple times to different people, telling people what you're doing for yourself. That makes it more real. So remember when I said that the process is nonlinear? This is critical, that you're not messing up if you've come up with a great story, you're starting to tell people things, and then, you know, it just so happens that one day something happens and you're just feeling terrible. That's okay. You know, you're not coming up with your story of resilience doesn't prevent bad things from happening. You know, so you might still experience challenges and it might throw you back into a thought spiral about some of the losses that you've already experienced. That's okay. You have to be willing to let yourself be sad about the things that you've lost, or be angry at times, you know, with being deprived of things, and that's okay. So as long as you're allowing the full spectrum of emotions, that, you know, it's okay to both laugh, cry, and everything in between on the same day. That is honoring your experience, and that is also part of recovering. That, you know, I think especially when there's been a loss of life, I think that there's some perhaps societal conditioning in, you know, saying, well, you should be sad, you know, you got to wear black and do all this stuff. And yes, a lot of those rituals are very important to us, but it's the being grieving, being in grief, or being in mourning. I mean, you know, that you can be in that process and still laugh about things. So this is an important reminder that the process is nonlinear, and therefore what we have to remember is to welcome all emotions and not suppress them because we think we shouldn't feel a certain way. So in a sense, that's validating yourself. I also love this graphic, and again, pulled from a blog, but it shows you that, yeah, you know, if you are feeling sad one day and you've kind of let yourself experience some of that sadness, you don't have to stay sad all day. It's okay to want to feel happy as well, as long as you're not totally avoiding the other feelings. And so if you need a little boost, there's all kinds of little things that you can do depending on the boost that you're looking for. And again, these are all pretty accessible activities, hacking your happiness chemicals. I really like in the the endorphin area, dark chocolate. I would say do that in moderation. But yeah, there's a variety of things that, you know, allows you to, you know, if you've had an unbalanced day and you're looking for a little boost, that are healthy ways to seek that boost. Okay, so one final reminder here about the grief process is that it is an ongoing process. It is the pandemic situation is evolving, and you know we're hoping for a light at the end of the tunnel, but you know it's not entirely predictable, and so we have to be ready to evolve, you know, and adapt emotionally to new circumstances, and that I think it does require, you know, a dose of acceptance that, you know, we can't predict things necessarily, and so we have to accept that part of our readiness is just be ready to adapt, and know that there might be future reminders of some of these losses that we've experienced, and that to the extent that we're developing our more resilient stories and rehearsing them with others, that we can hopefully use that as a coping tool to meet the challenges that may come in the future. A graph that I think is helpful in visualizing this process is that when we experience a crisis of some kind that really impacts our functioning, you can kind of view the steps of recovery here. So, you know, one on this chart here, 1 is like you're functioning before the crisis, 2 is the moment of crisis. And so there's this plunge in how well people are functioning after a big crisis. And then that's when recovery begins. And you can see 4 is this, you know, period of recovery where you're going up and down, just like we said. You know, it's not a fully linear trend there. It is going up for a little while, then maybe back down for a while, then up again for a while and back down for a while and up and down. So recognizing that, and it is possible that we might stabilize either feeling less well, functioning less well than we used to before the crisis. We might return to an equivalent level of functioning, or we might actually emerge from the period of crisis or the acute phase. We might emerge from that functioning better than we did before. And I think this may be part of kind of the motivation for the Great Resignation, that people see that. People saw the crisis as like a chance to build themselves back up better than they were before. And so I wanted to bring this old graph up. It came, you know, like looks like the first time this was published was 1949. So, you know, going 70 plus years ago. You know, that it's still useful. You know, it still shows us that, you know, recovery can actually bring us to a place that was better than before the stressful event. All right. So I want to introduce a brief caveat here for the last couple minutes before questions, that this whole process that I described is a self-help process, right? I mean, I did mention that you can see a professional to, you know, start working through this stuff, and so that's great too. But a lot of it is self-help, and I wanted to point out that self-help is not always sufficient. So we need to really be mindful of the signs that let us know when it's time for professional help, both in ourselves and in other people. And here are some of those signs that professional help are necessary. A lot of them may be pretty self-evident to you, depending on your background, but I'll go through them briefly. You know, anytime there's sudden changes in somebody's appearance or habits, especially things like sleeping, eating, basic daily activities, that's an indicator that the stressor is overwhelming and perhaps needs more than just self-help. Hopelessness, definitely something that requires professional help, especially if it persists for an extended period of time. Emotions, if you're used to experiencing somebody as fairly dynamic and then all of a sudden they're flat, or you know they have a really narrow range of emotions, like they're only one way, and that's not typical, might be an indicator. Or if your own experience is that way, like you remember feeling more dynamic yourself, and then you always just feel kind of this murky, blah, you know, flat feeling. That might be an indicator for professional help. Excessive avoidance or fixation on problems, that can indicate some anxiety that would benefit from professional help. Suicidality, of course, that's a no-brainer. It definitely requires emergency services, and if there is intent and plan and means to act. And this last one here, self-help ineffective. So this is one that I think gets forgotten. You know, you might have attended other presentations where they talk about the warning signs that somebody needs more help. I think this one often gets missed, that we try, a lot of us are trying really hard. Everyone that's attending today probably is, you know, does something to try to help themselves. You signed up for this presentation thinking that it could help. So, and I think that what happens with a lot of educational materials, like we as educators, myself included, want to equip people with skills that they can use to help themselves. But when that breaks down, where you go next, right? So sometimes even these skills that are relevant and helpful, they might not be enough. So if you're finding that you're engaging in all this and you think you're doing a decent job of self-care and self-help activities, and it's not making you feel better, then stop trying it by yourself. You know, that's the time to seek professional help. Okay, so I encourage you all to, if you are comfortable, to drop, you know, the beginnings of your stories in the chat box. I saw that you were able to do that. So, you know, it doesn't have to be your whole story, but, you know, maybe the start of that story if you want to share. So remember, the question was, you know, what has changed and how have I adapted, or what does it say about me that I'm surviving this thing right now? You know, so any initial answers to those questions, I'd love to see what people are saying, and it might be also a chance to provide each other support, practice what we're preaching, right? So I'll wait just a second for people to put their stories, or what they are, the initial pieces of their story in the chat. And while you're doing that, so I'm still interested in your answers to the question. I'm still interested to hear, what does it say about you that you're surviving this? I wanted to put this texting service out there for you to perhaps sign up for. We have partnered with the University of Maryland Extension and Maryland 211 to host a text messaging service that is supportive text messages in the areas of nutrition, mindfulness, and social connection. When we are thinking about stress management and you remember those foundational activities, we figured that these were pretty easy topics to address. And so sometimes a lot of us just need a little nudge to do something. And this service gives you 3 reminders per week in these areas. Not 9 messages a week, but 3 messages a week in these areas, 1 each. And they last for about 4 months. And at the end, you can let us know, like, if you made any changes as a result. But there are little reminders that maybe it's not new information to you, but it's that reminder that, oh yeah, I already believe in this and I need to act on it. So people have found it really useful. And actually, out of the feedback we've gotten so far, that that the vast majority of people do something at least once in a while in response to these texts. So if you need that nudge, I encourage you to sign up. All right, so I'm going to take a look at this chat here. Let me see if I can expand it so I can read it a little better. Okay, so I see some responses. I am learning to deeply embrace, okay, Catrice says, I am learning to deeply embrace my self-care regimen after 11 loved ones passing during the pandemic. Wow. It says I deeply loved myself and wish to live fully. Yeah, what a great thing to realize about yourself, that I do care about myself, and I want to live, and I want to keep going. Like that's a great beginning to that resilience story. Okay. Courtney says, the change in work schedule and working around the clock, I survived because I helped others. Wow. So interesting that, that helping others was a source of strength for you. I think that may be a pretty common experience. Okay. I have tried to keep aware of my own feelings and my son's feelings about the situation. Okay, so it sounds like maybe you've become more emotionally attuned both to yourself and the people that you care for. So that is definitely a sign of growth, and I'm sure that you're experiencing some benefits from that. My son died and I changed careers. That's sad to hear, but I also see that you kept moving, right? So even with some serious losses that we've all experienced, we are moving in some way. And to the extent that we can recognize that for ourselves, it doesn't negate the loss, doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden not sad anymore, but it does at least balance it out with a sense of forward motion. Well, thanks everyone for sharing those initial stories. I think now it's time for question and answer.
Yes. Thank you for providing this critical information during this great time of need. I know I learned a few things listening. We would like to open up the webinar now for questions. Remember that you will stay muted to avoid background noise, but you can type your questions into the box right-hand side of the screen if viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of the screen if viewing from a phone. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, or you have a comment about the webinar, please enter these into the question box now. If we do not have time to answer each question today, we will provide our contact information at the end of the webinar for anyone who may wish to reach us. So some questions that we've received: when a person is dealing with grief and not responding to someone reaching out to help them, should you stop reaching out?
Yeah, so I don't think you necessarily need to stop reaching out forever, but you don't want to be like banging down the door, so someone's communicating that they're not ready to talk by their silence. And so you may start, your next response to them, if they don't answer you, may be validating the silence, like saying, yeah, I could understand why you are, why it may be tough to talk about this, and then try to supply some reasons why that might be the case for them from their perspective, like, oh, because you're going through a lot right now and you don't, really feel like rehashing it and blah, blah, blah. So try to validate the silence and show that you're respecting that, and that will help them understand that your door is definitely still open, but that you're not going to push theirs down.
Do you have any group therapy session curriculum for this person asking the question to use with children?
I don't, but you might look at the Went Center. Let me spell that in the Went Center, which is based here in DC. They have a variety of trainings on grief, and they may have something that's for children.
I am a therapist in New York and found this to be very helpful. I'm finding with my high school age students, the loss of graduation, proms, etc., have been difficult to put meaning to. Any suggestions on how to guide this age in making meaning on losing things that are milestones in life?
I think it's, yeah, you can't necessarily make sense of the absence of that thing, but so the question of how did I adapt may be the one that gets them moving forward. Like, yeah, you lost out on walking across the stage in the typical parties. What did you do to mark that milestone yourself, or with a close group rather than the big public? You know, and if they say, I haven't done anything, well, then that's an activity for you to try to construct with them, is, well, what can we do? Like, let's do something, even if it's late.
How can student therapists serve as a supportive function to clients who lost a loved one during the pandemic?
How can student therapists use this information? Well, I would say go through the questions with your clients. I mean, these are all valid questions to be asking a client, and especially providing, you know, I don't know what you're allowed to do in your training program as a student therapist yet, but, you know, maybe you start with some psychoed about, you know, that 6th stage, and helping, you know, them learn that it's not just the 5 stages, and then you progress on to some of these questions.
When grieving begins during a terminal illness, how can someone be understanding of that?
I would say that the anticipatory grief is there. So you may have to be dealing with the worries about the loss itself, like imagining in the future, and kind of getting stuck at that point, and that kind of keeping you from enjoying the existing relationship. So, you know, there's definitely kind of a separate set of challenges with anticipated grief, but I would say that the focus should be on, you know, remaining present, and some of those mindfulness strategies may be helpful, because you know you're losing somebody, you want to make the most of the time that you have with them. And the future you, like if you're asking yourself, how will I emerge from this? Like the future you wouldn't want the present you to waste time worrying and not be with that loved one, and not be present with that loved one. So do future you a service by allowing yourself to remain present, even as those worries may still be in the background.
And I think we have time for one more. Is there a spiritual component to lost resilience?
Oh yeah, of course. So like I showed with the Sam says 8 dimensions of wellness, spiritual is one of them, and spiritual, you know, is definitely takes a variety of forms. And so you may utilize that spiritual, you know, self-care and spiritual resources that you can access on your own to help with the meaning-making process. That's definitely a valid strategy.
Thank you so much for your information and answering those questions. And I'm now going to turn it over for a couple closing remarks.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you again, Dr. Chan and Sarah, for volunteering your time this afternoon for this exceedingly useful discussion. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be emailed to registrants tomorrow. The webinar will also be uploaded to our website at www.namimd.org for any individuals who are unable to register for the webinar today. We hope that this webinar has been helpful for you this afternoon. At the end of the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. We plan to continue hosting educational webinars, and this survey will help determine how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. NAMI has partnered with BetterHelp to support our local healthcare workers by providing access to a free month of therapy. BetterHelp is convenient, private online therapy where you can talk to a licensed professional therapist at any time. If you are a healthcare worker, including mental health and/or substance use provider, be sure to fill out the post-webinar feedback forms to receive instructions and your discount code. And we can only offer these webinars free of charge because of the dedicated support of individuals and organizations like yours. While we already knew that 1 in 3 adults reported experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression, a new study found that 52% of adults have been more open with others about their mental health since the pandemic started. This This rising need means we need your help now more than ever, and we invite you to join us for our 2022 NAMI Walks Your Way Maryland campaign. NAMI Walks is a several months long campaign that promotes public awareness of mental health, reduces stigma, and supports our mission of recovery-focused support, education, and advocacy for individuals and loved ones affected by mental health conditions. This campaign will build on last year's success and will continue to explore and expand on the positive ways the arts impact mental health. We're excited to share that this year will be a hybrid of virtual and private in-person events that will begin in early spring and will include a virtual art showcase on Saturday, May 21st, 2022, and an in-person invite-only VIP wrap-up party on Saturday, July 9th, 2022. The first NAMI Walks took place in Maryland 20 years ago, and we invite you to celebrate this milestone with us as a participant for this incredible campaign. You can learn more about NAMI Walks and register for free at www.namiwalks.org/Maryland. We wish you all a safe and healthy rest of your week, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us through our website or by phone at 410-884-8691 should you need additional resources or support. Have a great rest of your day.